Um,
There we go.
cool. So the topic of election reform is massive, like incredibly huge. You can be talking about the structure of a ballot. You can be talking about anti-patronage measures or, bribery measures. You could be talking about things like weighted voting systems. I recently heard a proposal that the younger you are, the more your vote should be weighted because you have longer to live with the consequences. But there's also, a lot of people tend to focus on the kind of election reforms that would require a constitutional amendment, like enfranchising people under the age of 18 or getting rid of the Electoral College. So not really going to talk much about those because that's more of I think it's a heavier lift than we are really capable of right now. Plus, it's not what I specialize in. I specialize in local. Federal election reform in general is particularly difficult right now because of the courts. Last month, Salon was on court reform, and I think that goes hand in hand with election reform. Between the existing constitutional limits and these court decisions that go back as far as Buckley v. Vallejo, which is what made corporations people, and Citizens United, and the rolling back of voter protections like the Voting Rights Act. I just don't see a lot of options right now at the federal level that wouldn't be stamped out pretty quickly, unless it were at the level of a constitutional amendment. And that includes things especially like gerrymandering and campaign finance issues, unfortunately, which are two of the more pernicious issues for elections. Democrats recently tried to get the For the People Act through, but it failed in the Senate because a couple of senators refused to forego the filibuster. But it had tons of really good and really mediocre reforms in it, like limiting states from purging their voter rolls, which has become a real issue in places like Ohio, where they purge their rolls after 4 years if you haven't voted sometimes. Pre-registering minors, Motor Voter Act, requiring presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns. For Democrats abroad in particular, offered a lot of protections for overseas voters by requiring that they get sent ballots 45 days in advance, and hammering down on those states that claim you can't vote there if you've never lived there, even though it's your only state to have claim to. And it would also have paid for express postage to get the ballots back, but it failed and got stalled. So high-level election reform is just really, really difficult, which is why you see a lot of experimentation in terms of how democracy works and how elections work more at the local level, where you don't have those kind of constitutional and systemic limits. So I'm going to give 3 examples of these kind of reforms and kind of go into detail about them. And then hopefully we can chat about our values when it comes to democracy and whether reform can really help us to achieve those particular values. But first, let me give you just a quick summary of election structures at the city level in the US and kind of the history behind them. Prior to the progressive era, which was turn of the century, party machines ran cities. So it was kind of mafia-like. The police were privatized, and party bosses functioned as kind of union leaders, as ethnic leaders a lot of the time. It was all legal, but it was all pretty frustrating for any average citizen. And so you had the progressive era, which was all about getting government to step in and have these solutions to these issues of real corruption, really profound corruption. Hi, I think we have a new person that just joined us. Is it Chai or?
Hi, Chi.
Hi, it's Chi. Yeah, sorry, I just got off work, so.
Okay,
In the bus,
just to let,
listening in, thanks.
okay, you didn't really miss anything. I'm just talking about the structures of elections at the city level.
Okay.
And FYI, this is being recorded.
Okay, thank you. So,
Yep.
Well, sorry for the disturbance.
No worries. So as a response, there were all these groups, most importantly, the Rockefeller Foundation, which put together a clearinghouse to define what good governance could be at the city level, because a ton of cities were establishing city charters at the time, because that was seen as a much more transparent way to conduct city level governance. And it would establish their election structure so that it wouldn't just be parties running everything all the time. So in the following years, the vast majority of cities adopted 5 particular reforms. The first is that elections should be nonpartisan. And to this day, I believe 75% of cities are nonpartisan elections. The second is that elections should be held in an off year, and that's to prevent the parties at the higher level from having influence at the local level. So not having it during a presidential or a gubernatorial race or something like that. Elections should be at large. So everybody who's elected to a city council represents the whole city. And this was particularly a favorite of the Jim Crow South, because it really prevents minority groups from being able to have representation in their city council, since they're already very disenfranchised. Elected officials should not be paid. The idea was that being paid is inherently a corruption. So therefore, all officials should be unpaid. And you can imagine what the consequences of that were. So only people with a lot of leisure time and a lot of wealth could run for office. And then lastly, a city manager should run the city's day-to-day administration. So this was a real bifurcation of the political and the administrative state, with the idea that anything that is actually about the running of government should not be treated as a political issue, if that makes sense. So what happens is politicians end up being very beholden to national interests, because that's what's political. And whether there is a park in town or a stadium in that spot in town, well, that shouldn't really be a political decision. That's really just an administrative question. So that's what happened. And there are, 75% of cities adopted most of these reforms, and still 75% of cities have nonpartisan elections. The result of all this, as you might guess, is the depoliticization of local government. So people do not vote in local elections. I believe in Dallas in particular, I think they had the lowest turnout at 2% for their mayoral race, because they have all these things like it being in an off year. So people are traveling, often it's in the summer, it's just the worst time to get people to come out and vote. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples of city level election reform. They were all voted upon by referendum. They almost always have to be, though none of them had more than 50% turnout when the referendum was on the ballot. So take what you will on how democratic that is. The first one is New York City. They recently implemented ranked choice voting in 2021. This is not a city that I studied, but I was very interested in how that went down. The way ranked choice voting works is you have the list of candidates, say 15, and you pick your top 5 and you list them in order. If anybody gets 50% first place votes, then they automatically win. If nobody has 50% of the first place votes, then the person with the least first place votes gets eliminated, and they go to those ballots second choice and do another round. And it just goes in rounds until you have a 50% winner. The idea is that this gets at people's true preferences more than just yay or nay on a candidate. And it also is supposed to help third party and independent candidates, because you don't feel like you're wasting your vote if you can vote for the third party and then vote for the person who you think is actually going to win, for example. So it allows people to have a little bit more freedom at the ballot. It also reduces negative campaigning quite a bit because you don't want to alienate voters that support your opponent too much, because you want to be second choice for them. So it actually has a kind of a civilizing effect, I guess, to the debates. But where it fails is that many people are arguing that it rewards highly sophisticated voters, people who have the time to research all the candidates and to really have a very in-depth idea of what they want out of policy, rather than just kind of saying, okay, this is my guy, I'm getting on board. So people have argued, there's not tons of data yet because it's so new, but people have argued that groups that are less politically engaged or unable to be as politically engaged, so poor people, people of color, non-English speaking people, they get left out. And if people are suspicious of institutions and election bureaucracy already, this whole multiple rounds of voting and a little bit confusing system is not really going to help to prevent them from speculating about nefarious activity. So those are kind of the drawbacks to it. The second one that I want to talk about is a little bit complicated, but it's good because it's a creative way to approach campaign finance issues. So Seattle in 2017 implemented democracy vouchers. What this meant was that every resident of Seattle above the age of 18, resident, not registered voter, received 4 $25 vouchers called democracy vouchers to give to the candidate of their choice for city council or mayor or city attorney. You had to, if you were a candidate, you had to collect 400 signatures and get a nominal donation from each of those people, about $5 or $10. And then you could qualify for the program and start receiving the vouchers, up to $150,000 worth for primary, $150,000 for the general. If you participate in the program, you can't spend more than that, more than $150,000 per election. And if a non-participating opponent raises more and spends more, you can be released. You can petition to be released from the limitations. So this includes independent expenditures, which are very closely tracked in Seattle elections, unlike in a lot of other places. So this really gets at this idea that, to me, it concedes the argument that money is democratic participation. It's saying that this is a voice and it should be more inclusive, and we should take measures to be more inclusive in that way. So I think it concedes some of the issues that we have with the Supreme Court decision, but the idea is that participation, more people, it's good. Expanding it is good. Candidates should be talking to average voters rather than sitting in a room dialing for dollars to people who have a history of giving, is kind of the idea, and then get big money out of politics. Where it fails is business or organizationally backed candidates. They don't have to participate in the program, which they couldn't make it mandatory because of the Supreme Court. So this was a workaround. But my research showed that, so the candidates get released all the time. So when I was studying it, I was sitting in the meeting where they were making the decision on whether to release the candidates because an opponent had raised 5,000 more than 150,000. And they said, yeah, I guess, I don't really know if 5,000 is that much. And I realized there was nobody from the campaigning industry in the room to clarify it for these attorneys. And they said, okay, we'll release them. And the next day, there were like $500,000 in checks from unions written to one of the candidates. It was instant that the labor candidate went boom. So that's a problem. And my research also showed that the system really favors people who have a political network and are already in with the political professional community, because they know how to target those 400 signatures that they have to get in order to start accessing the money, and they know who's likely to give a voucher. So they already have these lists on hand, and they're ready to go. It's all in the can. And if you can get an apparatus up and going really, really quickly, you get access to the money a lot earlier and can start talking to voters a lot earlier. So it's it ended up really favoring incumbents and people with really strong ties to the political professional community. Yeah, also, if you wrote a voucher to somebody who didn't qualify or had already hit the $150,000 limit, that voucher just disappeared. And in the end, there was over $300,000 in vouchers written that were never distributed to candidates. So I find that to be a really big issue if you're saying that this is a way to get people participating in a way that is similar to voting or any other kind of direct political participation, and then just sort of doing away with the voucher afterwards. So yeah, then the third example that I want to move to is San Antonio, which is the other city. So my study was a comparative study of the election reforms in Seattle and San Antonio. In San Antonio, they had all of the original good governance reforms, with the exception of at-large elections, which they got rid of in the 70s. I'm just going to finish the San Antonio one, and then I'll get to your question, Eric. So they still are the largest city with a city manager, for example, and she gets paid like 500 grand a year. And they didn't have a paid mayor or a paid city council at the time. So the reform was to pay them. And what's wild about it is that if you just look at the municipality itself, San Antonio is the 7th largest city in America, which means that each city council member represented 140,000 people and was not being paid to do any of that kind of constituent services work or anything like that. So they decided to pay them, I believe it was 40,000, around 40,000 a year, and for the city councilors, and 60,000 for the mayor, which is less than half of what the Seattle City Council makes, by the way. But it was seen to be kind of the average income for a household in San Antonio. My research showed that it did change who ran for office. There were a lot of people who were not independently wealthy, who would not have run otherwise. And this was like a great opportunity for them to actually get involved in politics. But the people who won were still people with very deep ties to the political elite community and to local growth, business-minded industries. So basically you had to be friends with a local kingmaker in order to win your district election. So I'm going to open things up now. I also have a list of books that I'll recommend at the end, if you are curious about any of the stuff. Yeah, so my kind of general question is, what are your thoughts on these 3 particular reforms? How do they align with your vision of good representation and democratic systems? And do you think it kind of gets closer to what your vision of good democracy would be? Eric, you had your hand up.
I think Liz had her hand up first.
Okay, Liz.
Yeah, so my question was just, so with the voucher program in Seattle, so say you've reached your cap, but your opponent is not participating and has raised more, so you petition to get released from the program. Do you still get to keep the money from your vouchers? Okay,
Yes.
I just wondered, like, it was like, okay, well, you've been released, so now it's like you never raised that money. So you do still get that leg up in fundraising, but then you have the, okay, interesting.
Yep. And Eric?
Yeah, So I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think comparative. It's really important to have this comparison to other systems, because that's really the only way to. There's not that much data, of course, because there's not many countries and there's not many different places that offer different voting systems. But when you do take a look around, at least you can probably increase your information, and I think it's a good way to come to some sort of conclusion. So what I posted here were first an image of all the countries that have some sort of a fair, quote unquote, proportional representation. And then of course the countries, former British Empire countries that all have first past the post systems. Interestingly, as you probably noticed, in a lot of these countries, almost every single one of them, you essentially only have two parties, because it's really difficult to have any other system that can actually have the resources to be able to pump out candidates that can actually win elections. So I think that's certainly really frustrating, and I'm really excited about the movement around, say, rank-based voting that has happened. I think there's a lot of potential advantages into it. Interestingly, I think I remember in New York and a few other places, they actually used to have rank-based voting a long time ago. But actually in New York, they got rid of it because the Democrat Party didn't like outside candidates that ended up winning elections. So you do have actually historical precedents of having even the Democrat Party, who tends to be more reform focused and actually being against some of these policies. But yeah, I think you know a bit of my stance in previous calls, that I'm first, electoral systems is something that I'm really passionate about. And second, I think it's tremendously urgent that we have some reform with our electoral system, not just getting rid of our electoral college, but actually a change in our system. I think ranked choice voting is important, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts about proportional rank-based voting, namely, say, proportion. So I don't. Do you know Fair Vote? Fair Vote is the organization. So that they describe our rank-based voting in some different sides, but they also talk a little bit about proportional rank-based voting. And I wonder, sorry, I know I've been going for a while. I wonder what your thoughts are on one of the criticisms people apparently bring up that you brought up about ranked choice voting is that you need to be well informed about the different candidates, and then this can potentially bias the elections towards people that are informed. There's a lot of hybrid systems, though, that allow you to also have rank-based voting based on parties. And I wonder if you have, so again, in this link shows an indication of how you can rank based upon party and you can rank based upon candidate. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, some sort of hybrid system.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you would do proportional representation outside of a party system. I don't see how that would work.
I think Germany does it.
Yeah.
Where you divide your votes between, so there's you divide your votes between essentially rank-based voting for the candidates that you like. You can decide if you want to vote, first, second, third, fourth. You can go down the whole list. You could even go down to these are my top 15 candidates in that order. You don't need to, but you can. And then in addition, so on the other side of the ballot, there's different ways that you can form your ballot. On the other part of it, then you also have a rank of the parties that you have interest in. Then you can split the vote based upon the party that gets this amount of seats, but the candidate within those parties that got the most votes has the priority, and then you go down from there.
I mean, I was specializing in nonpartisan elections entirely. Like, you're not allowed to have a party affiliation on the ballot. So that's what I'm saying when I say I don't know how proportional representation would really work if there was straight up no parties whatsoever.
I see. Yeah, I agree.
But I agree. I think it's a more just system. I also think that anything that threatens the power of the Democratic and Republican parties is going to be squashed pretty fast. I just don't see an apparatus for moving that up the pipeline. You would have to have so much money and the system is already in place. Like every single person who does mailers, every single person who does TV ads, every single person who is a consultant, every single person who is a field worker, they are so partisan aligned. They have to be in order to maintain their business. The industry itself is so dependent upon these two parties. I just don't know how I just don't see it happening electorally.
But what about the tremendous amount of disruption that we have? Probably the midterms might be a watershed moment for this, but I mean the tremendous amount of disruption you have between the very, very moderate Democrats, Joe Manchin, etc. And of course, you know, dare I say, of course, the Republican Party, you know, there's so much division between both parties, the Trumpists and the traditional Republicans.
I mean, I just wonder if there's any way to do it that wouldn't just be spun by the Republican Party as this is another way Democrats are trying to steal the election. I know that there are plenty of groups, especially like Fair Vote, that are trying to approach this as a political possibility, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence that it would work just because of how entrenched the campaigning industry is. I mean, it's the same reason why, you know, in San Antonio, all these new people ran for office. There were 10 people running for each city council seat, which is double, triple than had ever run before. And yet it was the same candidate that won. And it's because of the ties that they have to the system that's relatively informal, but also understood by everybody.
So do you think like a slow reform coming from local level, as you mentioned, most reform is happening anyway, may end up being the biggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why, you know, there are a lot of cities looking to do ranked choice voting now because of New York, including places like Seattle, which, man, they are just reform happy these days. Every cycle, they've got a new one. But yeah, and, you know, I do think that we should look at the places that do have the freedom and political capacity to do that kind of experimentation, especially something as drastic as saying the voting system is the whole system is changing. Yeah, I mean, at the end of my thesis, I said I think that there should be local parties. I think, you know, not the Democratic or Republican parties, but more specific issue-based parties that are truly local. And that would really be the answer to this very powerful elite network that you find in almost every city, though the configuration is different, because there just has to be some sort of institutional power somewhere, institutional memory, institutional power somewhere. And parties are a really good way to do that. Yeah, Liz.
I know this is a little outside of your research, but I was just wondering, do you know like what the average is that's spent on local elections? Or do you have any kind of idea what the range is?
It's huge. So so the reason why I compared San Antonio and Seattle is because San Antonio is one of the poorest cities in America and Seattle is one of the wealthiest, and their elections represent that. So in San Antonio, you can buy yourself a city council seat for 30 grand and represent twice as many people as Seattle, where you need to spend about $500,000.
Okay. Yeah, this is 13 plus years ago, because it was before I moved to Switzerland and before I left the job I had before we moved to Switzerland. A friend of mine looked at running for city council in Peoria and found at that time that people were spending 30,000.
Yeah.
And I mean, Peoria is not a wealthy city. So it's interesting to me that that San Antonio, that's so much bigger, that's about the same
Yeah.
amount being spent. I mean, Peoria is not the 8th largest city in America, so
Well,
that's just interesting.
in
Yeah.
St. Louis.
Also,
oh,
Peoria
sorry.
is has unions, right? It's Illinois, so you've got these kind of side organizations that can spend a lot of money. So 30,000, yeah, that's a lot of money for Peoria, and they probably have other groups spending even more. Whereas in San Antonio, unions don't kind of do that very much. Chi, you have your hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Tori, for this talk. Very interesting. I was just wondering how widespread, the movement towards local election reform is, and in what kind of areas it tends to be, and what kind of and which of the models tend to be proposed.
Well, I would say that there has been a dismantling of the kind of racist and classist and anti-participatory structures slowly for the last 70 years. They've been reforming charters to move away from the original 5 standards of good governance. So almost everybody is at ward-based system now. Seattle was one of the last. They changed it in 2015. Immediately became a city council that was majority people of color. Same thing happened in almost every major city. So your question is about, you said the movement for electoral reform at the local level. I wouldn't say there is one. I would say they crop up in each place, kind of due to the individual kind of political ecosystem that you find there. However, an exception to that would be there's a lot of reforms that come out of academia and they get filtered through the nonprofit sector and put into place. Democracy vouchers in Seattle are a good example of that. Larry Lessig is an academic at Harvard who came up with this idea, and then it kind of went through the NGOs of Seattle. He's kind of looking for somebody to direct it through. And so they wanted to be kind of the vanguard to do this. And then it got picked up, and now Andrew Yang is talking about it as a thing that we should do nationally. Even though I would say it wasn't that great for democracy overall, or it didn't fix the problem of big business. So I'm not really sure how to answer your question beyond that. Yes, there are organizations that are working towards very specific reforms like that, that are doing small level experiments and then looking to see how that goes and then expanding. But I wouldn't call anything, there aren't a lot of grassroots. There's not a grassroots movement, not truly. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I was
Eric,
hoping it would be something more widespread. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is that these systems are so different. I mean, you've got these kind of weak mayor systems where the mayor is essentially like just another city council vote versus they have all of this executive power. You have systems that are partisan, like on the East Coast in particular, these partisan systems. I mean, the parties go hard for the partisan ones. So, every single place is different. And then you have the actual community that's so different, like where you have a right to work states where unions really don't play much of a role except to show up to knock on doors. And then you have states that are heavily union, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on a city council race on, the south side of some town, it's kind of crazy how different they all are. So I'm not sure that there are a whole lot of reforms that could be a blanket thing that's thrown across the whole country.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah. Ooh. Eric had something.
Well,
Liz
first,
put her hand up.
Oh. Does Ellen or Jazz, do Ellen or Jazz have any comments otherwise?
Go for it.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to address your, was it second or third topic on salary? Maybe it was the third topic. And you know, of course, there's really often very little interest in paying politicians more money. And I don't really seeing this also being very feasible, but equally unfeasible. But potentially a solution to this would be, I know I brought this up in a previous salon. Would there, do you think there's any interest in, or do you see building, say, a decentralized virtual system where you have less of a need to have a salaried professional politician to make the decisions? Could something like this potentially get around that and make reform a bit easier?
I don't understand.
If instead we remove the city council, I guess this is getting really hypothetical now, but if you remove the city council and then deferred a lot of decisions that city council normally do to a, I'm not suggesting a particular system, but let's just say, for instance, a popular majority virtual platform, where essentially every major decision is voted on, I don't know, by referendum, virtual referendum, or some sort of system that facilitated this process. So it didn't anyway.
Yeah.
There's companies like GitHub, for instance. There's a lot of computer science-based companies that do systems like this, and it's tend to work, or at least they can work in some setting. I wonder if, in this case, by getting rid of the focus on the politicians, may also be able to resolve some of this complication that we have with party influence, corruption in politics.
You know, I think this is a really classic question of whether your representative should be a trustee or a delegate.
Yep. Yep.
And I tend to fall into the trustee side, not because I think that politicians are special in any way. I just think that people are busy. And I think that
that's a good point. Yep.
To understand like the zoning laws in a district they don't like even live in, and the ramifications of it, you know, of moving, say, a mobile home community so that they can expand a park to invite tourists further into that district, driving up prices and potentially driving more people out, you know, that kind of thing. Like, can they really spend their time considering all of this?
Don't get me wrong. I don't think that this will necessarily increase political engagement by a lot of people that are already busy. But at least it provides the avenue to do so if you have a controversial thing on the ballot.
Yeah, so actually it's funny, the city council reform in San Antonio started because they decided to fund a streetcar project, and then a whole bunch of people on the suburbs in the north side, which is predominantly white, petitioned against it. And they put forth a referendum that would require the city to have a referendum anytime they vote on something major like this.
That's funny.
And they said, oh no, you want to change how we do governance? Let's start a charter review commission. And then they completely took the streetcar issue off the table and made it about paying themselves. So that's how that went. So yeah, I think often people with power and leisure time will dominate systems.
But that's exactly the frustration, is that, you know, people with power and frustrations and vested interest gets involved so much when you have a really small amount of people that can make all the decisions, or at least that's what it seems like. If you can dilute it by having more people that have the chance to, I don't know, pass healthcare reform or pass climate change initiatives because they actually care about those things. The rest of the things with, you know, fixing the streets, maybe just 10 or so people will actually care about those policies. But if you, I don't know if decentralizing it might end up being Anyway,
Yeah, I don't know. In our nationalized political environment, I'm not sure that's really possible. I think there are a lot of people that will say government shouldn't spend money on things, period, that kind of thing. I just don't know. But yeah, I mean, I look at a place like Switzerland and their direct democracy, and it
Yeah.
tends to statistically have a very conservative bent when you have a highly referendum driven system. They tend to stick with the old ways longer.
but is that also, I saw a lot of breakdown in that a lot of this may also have to do with the general population shape. So if you have more people that are older, like especially I guess
Yeah.
upper middle income countries with the aging population, then they tend to lean more conservative.
Yeah, but you know, women got the vote in 1920 in the US and they got it in 1972
Fine.
in Switzerland. So
I think Switzerland's a unique case, but fine. I've talked enough. I think Liz wants to say.
yeah, Liz.
No, that's my hand up from before. I don't have something else. But I was going to say, I think that I know Australia has automatic voter registration and it's required that you vote.
It's required that you submit a ballot. I believe you
well,
can leave it blank.
Okay, but you have to do something.
Yeah.
You have to nominally participate in the process. Do they, I guess they're kind of trending conservative, nationalistic at the moment, as is a lot of the Western world. So I guess that's not too surprising, but I don't know. I guess it just seems, it almost feels like nothing is going to fix this. Like I don't know.
Well,
I mean, compulsory voting is an option. I would say vote by mail has been really successful in the US. The states that have switched to entirely vote by mail, like sure, you can drop your ballot off if you want, but entirely vote by mail, they've seen incredible rise in turnout. And it, you know, the data shows that it actually doesn't benefit one party or the other. It truly is just an expanding system. I think that would be something that is kind of getting at what you're wanting, which is a way that the government actually takes an active step to touch voters directly, rather than just saying, hey, come here if you want. You know, and I do think that those are more effective. Yeah. Okay, bye, Pete.
I think yes, voting reform, electoral reform doesn't necessitate that all of a sudden we become the most democratic and fair country in the world. But I guess there's still a lot of things that already make it less fair that at least you can improve it. So, I mean, it's kind of funny when you're on the, at least when I'm browsing on the Wikipedia page for election reform, some of the most reformed countries are some of the most corrupt countries in the world. So it feels it's difficult to make a point because I'm like trying to share images of like, oh yeah, Russia has a nice fair system, but it doesn't make it fair. But I think again, at the very least, you know, culture is a big part of it, along with other factors. At the very least, if you do have a unfair system, might as well try to improve it.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was wondering is what makes the system unfair to you?
That's a good question.
I mean, my pet complaint about US electoral politics is gerrymandering, which, as you said at the beginning, is very difficult to fix, especially since the Supreme Court keeps saying that it's not unconstitutional to gerrymander the crap out of things. So I like all the ideas I have to try to improve politics, it just feels like it's not going to happen. There's just no way it's going to happen. So it feels And unlike you, I don't have much experience or information about local election reform and how you can start to like improve things from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down.
I'm personally very optimistic with what Tori mentioned about a lot of new solutions. First, they come out of academia, then they go through NGOs, and then they kind of enter politics at the local level. So it does look as if, maybe there's some unofficial pipeline at which things can kind of innovate and try new things and slowly integrate into society. So in that sense, I'm pretty excited. It doesn't prevent me from, thinking about exotic solutions because, might as well try. Innovation always has to start somewhere.
I guess it's so slow. The process is so slow.
But
and when it feels like everything is like breaking right now, doing these slow improvements.
But that's the point. the point, things are slow until they're not. And that's it's always like all societies are kind of like this. I think it makes sense to then, think about what solutions can make sense, try them out so that when shit hits the fan, I'm not saying it is going to hit the fan, but when things start changing, at least you have an idea of what that reform can look like. I wouldn't get too hold back based upon the rate of things right now. I think, what you learn today can still contribute somewhere in the future.
Yeah. It's just, I get very frustrated.
Yeah, I think all of us on the call are very frustrated.
Yeah, I think the Electoral College issue in particular has always been the one that really got to me. Mainly, I just thought that it defies the whole notion of one person, one vote. Like it's just completely upending of that. But then I read this book called The Politics of Resentment, which I really recommend, where Kathy Kramer, she went to these coffee clutches in Wisconsin, which is where groups of people always get together and just chat. They're often like at gas stations. They just kind of, the kind of gas stations that has a few tables with a restaurant style. And she just listened to what they said in these rural communities. And she identified this sort of urban-rural divide where the rural community really orients all of their politics in resentment towards the urban community. And I started thinking about the Electoral College again, and I was like, oh, that's not going anywhere. When I realized that in a state as divided as Wisconsin, but with a very high population that would benefit from getting rid of the Electoral College, really still orients so much of their politics in this kind of rural identity, even though 80% of people live in the suburbs.
And I think, I don't know if this is what it doesn't entirely inspire why I'm kind of keep on talking about these exotic things, but I do think, for one, a lot of some of the challenge in actually making change is because, again, not only vested interest, but vested identity into the systems that exist currently. But if you move far, if you talk about something far enough away, maybe it can provide a little bit of a neutral platform for everyone to think about, because there's just no impression that people have of a virtual system. there's no emotional sense. I don't know, aside from, I guess, the emotional investment that we have in the Constitution and in the current government that we have. But at least it's kind of more even across the board. You're dealing with something that's so far removed that I don't know.
I have a few books to recommend. I can just send the list, but I can also talk really quickly about them. The first is Dark Money. Maybe you guys have already read it, but it really explains what happened after Citizens United and why that was such a fundamental shift in campaign finance. It's by Jane Mayer. Another one, if you're interested in these kind of the history of governing structures at the city level in the US, I recommend Urban Fortunes by John Logan and Harvey Mallett. It's an oldie but a goodie. It's written in 1987, but man, it is spot on. And then I've got Democratizing Inequalities, Dilemmas of the New Public Participation. That's it's editors, so it's a series of pieces of essays, but it really is about how groups, organizations, and corporations are able to kind of co-opt these tools of democracy to not necessarily get at democratic results. So check that out. Building a Business of Politics by Adam Scheingate is about the rise of the campaign consulting industry, and it goes through the whole history of it from the 20s to now, and how it became such a powerful industry. Then I've got Electoral Engineering, Voting Rules and Political Behavior by Pippa Norris. That's a really academic one, but it may answer some of your questions, Eric, in particular. Partisans and Partners, The Politics of the Post-Keynesian Society, talks about kind of the fall of traditional parties in cities that had partisan systems and how it's now public-private partnerships, it was hard to say, that really drive local politics. So it's a privatization and neoliberalization of local politics. And then Affluence and Influence by Martin Gilens. That is the book on how wealthy people have a disproportionate effect on policy in the United States. It's a good page turner. And then the classic is Hannah Pitkin, The Concept of Representation. That's from 1967, and that sort of breaks down all of these ideas of what should representation be, and how should we think about it. Man, that's, yeah, I'll send the list. I'll put it in the chat right now.
Yeah, I was trying and I got behind on the one that said democratizing, was it inequalities?
Yeah.
And it didn't immediately pop up. And so then then I was behind. It's like, okay,
there you go.
I quit.
I think I also put No Middle Ground in there, which is sort of about the way parties work at the local level in California.
Okay.
How they've changed from kingmakers to sort of a series of high interest policy demanders. So organizations that have a single issue and then kind of coordinate with one another to back a candidate. So again, pretty academic, but I like it.
Are you trying to make us
my book club will say if I turn these in as all my my suggestions for the second?
I would say half of them are definitely written for the average American to understand politics better, and half of them are not.
Yeah,
okay.
well,
it sounds like you're trying to make us do a PhD in electoral reform in the United States. It's
I wish everybody would. Have friends to talk to.
I wish everyone would do a PhD in chemistry. I mean,
okay, I'll try.
I could barely pass basic chemistry my freshman year of college. There's no way I'm making it through a PhD, but I'm working on one in something akin to a political science story, so I'll be able to talk to you about it soon.
Yay.
The issue is most of my book club is not Americans, so they would super not care about it.
Oh no, actually the Pippa Norris book is international.
Okay.
Yeah, that looks pretty interesting.
Anyway, you can join my book club and
okay.
vote for these. Anyway.
Awesome. We have 2 minutes left, or how much?
We have
time?
2 minutes.
Any thoughts, Jazz and Ellen? Y'all were pretty quiet.
I completely enjoyed just listening in, I have to say, because that's sometimes when one gets enough inspiration to think about certain topics from certain types of angles. And you gave me a lot of information that I also do want to research now, because we all don't know everything, of course. And I'm very grateful for the knowledge that you shared with us today. Yeah, and it was there were 2-3 points where I was not confused, but it was more alongside of something that we spoke about today during our caucus leaders meeting of the party modernization that can happen, and that we're trying to get support within DA to encourage our DNC representatives to participate in this. But it was partially scratching on the surface of that, and partially a complete different topic. But I found it very interesting. That's why I was more in the background, just listening in. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
But again, thank you very much.
Thank you as well. I've been out of the States since 1986, so I haven't thought about local politics, state or local, in a long time. So it was quite interesting just to see where things are these days, or how bad or how good they are. So it's quite interesting. Thank you.
And I can't remember, Ellen, which state do you vote in?
I vote in Georgia, which was the
Okay.
last place I lived in the States.
Interesting.
I've lived in Georgia.
Georgia is fascinating.
Important state.
County.
Oh. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining me and for listening. And if you have any questions,